Welcome to everybody, to our viewers, to our panelists, to those who'll be watching this after the recording is uploaded to our YouTube channel on the Enoch Seminar YouTube channel website. We are now at our final session, third day of part two of reading the New Testament within Judaism, question mark. We have an exceptional panel, a beautiful group of panelists that are going to discuss a nice array of literature that's not in the New Testament canon, because that was one of the desires requested by many of the participants. Why not also look at some of the early Christian literature that may be contemporaneous to the New Testament with respect to the questions about whether the New Testament and non-New Testament literature are within Judaism. So this panel is unique in that regard. We have several different books. Each panelist has been given up to 10 minutes to discuss the three questions that have been relayed to them that are available on the Enoch Seminar webpage for this conference, available in the chat box for those who are watching. You can see the schedule there. We're going to proceed in the order, the latest order that has been updated in that schedule, one by one. Once the presentations are done, we will then have plenty of room for discussion, I hope, interesting discussion to interact with one another, even challenge one another, and naturally flow with whatever remaining time there may be, with some concluding reflections on the entire project of this conference. And at that time, other panelists or attendees may join us as well online. So without further ado, we're going to start with Lily Vuong, who will talk to us about the Protoevangelium of James.
Can you hear me? Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. I, of course, have to start by thanking Isaac and Gabriella and, of course, Megan, too, for inviting me to participate in this really important workshop. I also have to apologize because something critical came up with my university, and I am going to have to pop out before the end of all the presentations, but I hope to pop back in so that I can address any questions that people might have. So thank you for accommodating my situation. So I'd like to offer some brief thoughts on the question that we were all asked to consider on our appointed text. And of course, I was asked to speak specifically about the Protoevangelium of James. So the Protoevangelium of James is one of the most influential texts of the so-called apocryphal Gospels, and as such, shifts us into a different kind of genre in writing because of its unique goals and intentions. It was composed in the 2nd century, and it narrates the circumstances surrounding Jesus's birth, hence its common categorization as an infancy narrative. But more primarily, it provides the backstory to the birth and infancy of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Such narrative details include an introduction to her parents, Anna and Joachim, their portrayal as pious and devout Jews, but also it provides tantalizing details about Mary's own upbringing, including her dedication to the temple, her relationship with the priesthood, and the text is concerned for ritual purity. So today I was asked to consider how or whether we might consider this text within Judaism and all considerations of the challenges that come with labeling or categorizing this text in this way. So I'll begin with how I understand that phrase and then suggest some criteria for applying it if we were able to apply it to the Protoevangelium, and then conclude with some reflections on what changes when we approach the text in this way. So within Judaism, when I speak of a text being within Judaism, I'm not assuming that the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity in the 2nd century were clearly fixed. On the contrary, I see these boundaries between the two, or I see the boundaries between the two as being very fluid and contested, and often only retrospectively drawn. Much of my own research has been on challenging these boundaries and complicating these narratives that view the relationship as clean and distinct entities, instead looking to read in diverse texts the sustained and complex interactions between Jews and Christians in late antiquity. Like many others participating in this workshop, I find the essentialist labels problematic, immalleable, and unreflective of the complicated and diverse ways identities were constructed in the ancient world. As such, reading a text within Judaism then does not mean classifying it as Jewish rather than Christian. For me, it means recognizing the ways in which the text's idioms, concerns, narrative logic are deeply embedded in Jewish traditions, practices, and institutions, and allowing that embeddedness to shape our interpretation. So a few criteria help me help me locate as much as I can locate a text like this along what I view as being a nonlinear, multifaceted spectrum of complex identities. So first, scriptural intertextuality. Does the text think with the scriptures of Israel, drawing on the characters, patterns, and allusions, not simply as a proof text to support a theological position, but as a valued expression of identity? Does the text express engagement, including literary style, phrases, thoughts, vocabulary with other biblical texts, which then allow for a richer and multi-layered narrative and meaning, to its narrative details? Do the rituals associated with Jewish life and practices such as ritual purity, temple practice, temple service, vows, marriages, and childbirth heavily shape the narrative's plot, not only in terms of the conflicts, but also by way these tensions are resolved? What views are held about the temple and the priesthood specifically? Are the portrayals of the temple and the priesthood embedded in the narrative in a way that reflects a deep value and a continued active presence, and not simply as an invalidated institution of earlier times? And finally, how does the text present and position its protagonists and their self-understanding? Are they Israelites embedded in the Jewish life, or are they outsiders to it? I want to move on to now whether or not we can think about this text and all the complexities with it when we use the terms within Judaism. As I have argued elsewhere, the Protoevangelium is deeply invested in expressions of Jewish thought and practice. So, for instance, in terms of scriptural intertextuality, it's long been observed that the structure of the text itself relies very heavily on foundational characters, especially from the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible, in order to convey its ideas. For instance, Joachim and Anna are cast as a new Abraham and Sarah, or a new Elkanah and Hannah, an elderly barren couple who receive a child of promise through prayer and divine visitation. Mary's early life parallels Samuel's as she's dedicated to the temple service, but even more, she's enveloped in holiness, fed by the hand of an angelic messenger, and associated with weaving the temple veil. These narrative details are not incidental echoes. They provide the interpretive grammar by which the text makes sense of Mary's purity and her identity. The narrative is also structured by ritual concerns and logic. When Mary reaches puberty, the priest must remove her from the temple in order to preserve its sanctity. Joseph is chosen as her guardian by lot, a recognizably priestly practice. When Mary is found to be pregnant, both she and Joseph undergo the famous drink test, a ritual ordeal before the priest, sharing important parallels with Mishnah Sota's procedures of Numbers 5, which is designed to prove or disprove sexual transgression. Even the birth scenes are shaped by Jewish purity concerns. Who may witness? Who must withdraw? How witnesses are tested? The movement of the plot is heavily influenced by concerns for ritual obligations, and the priests serve as adjudicators of this purity and sanctity. Additionally, the temple itself is a central character. Its veil, its sacred spaces, its priests drive the story forward. In fact, the Protoevangelium imagines a living priestly world in which lots are cast, priests pronounce verdicts, and temple service is ongoing and valid. For a text composed after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, this is incredibly striking. It shows that the temple remained an active site of memory and imagination for the author and audience, not merely a ruined institution of the past. Now, some have rightly pointed out, however, that some details that point to an engagement with Jewishness or Judaism or whatever we want to call it, including Mary's residence in the temple, that's usually one of the first things that is cited, seem implausible. That may be historically true, but the point may not be historical accuracy. The story draws on Jewish imaginary, where holiness, vows, cultic service, all are coming together as one. Another important dimension here is the portrayal of Jewish authorities. In much early in other Christian literature, priests and scribes appear as hostile figures, foils against which Jesus and his followers are defiant. But in the Protoevangelium, the priests are not viewed in antagonistic ways. They're not enemies. They function as guardians of holiness, acting to preserve the sanctity of the temple and the community. Their testing of Mary and Joseph is not malicious. It's presented as a necessary ritual to avert scandal. Even their decision to entrust Mary to Joseph is framed as obedience to divine will mediated through the casting of lots. This largely positive presentation suggests that the text is not interested in vilifying Jewishness, Judaism, but in situating Mary and her family squarely within its institutions and traditions. It's not a text that it is a text that does not construct this Jewishness or Judaism as the other, but presumes it as the framework of holiness and order and necessary for understanding what the text is trying to do. So, what changes when we read the Protoevangelium in this way? I think there are several changes that are worth highlighting. First, methodological interpretive changes. If we stop treating these Jewish elements as decorative backdrops and start reading them as the text's structural logic and driving force, we can widen our archival comparanda, and we can also be more open to other promising interpretive frames. For example, the theme of Mary's purity, a very dominant theme throughout the text, can be understood not only in doctrinal terms, but also meaningfully interpreted in terms of ritual discipline and purity. What is recognized in Jewish, which is recognized in Jewish practices of vows and specifically temple proximity. To be sure, one could object that the text is preserved, transmitted, and ultimately canonized only in later Christian circles, and that its primary legacy is found in Marian doctrine. That may very well be true. But the presence of later Christian reception should not obscure the story's underlying structure and narrative logic. The narrative speaks most intelligibly when read within Jewish scriptural and ritual within the Jewish scriptural and ritual world from which I think it emerged. Second, reading the text within Judaism resists the temptation to see early Christianity as a religion already separate from Judaism. The Protoevangelium shows us a community still thinking, imagining, and storytelling in Jewish terms. It demonstrates the so-called parting of the ways was gradual, uneven, and incomplete. Reading the Protoevangelium in this way both clarifies and complicates how early Christ believers envisioned and present Mary and Jesus as not outside Israel's world, but deeply within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, for that wonderful presentation. We're very grateful for it. Protoevangelium of James was one of the texts that we wanted to have included in this conference, and so we're very grateful for that presentation. Let's move on to our second presenter, Gavin McDowell, who will be deliberating about First Clement and the Epistle of Barnabas. We're
Gavin, we
unable.
seem to have lost your microphone.
Yeah, there you go.
We can't hear you.
Hello?
Yep.
Yes, now we can hear you.
All right. I will not belabor thanks because I've already lost time and it's exactly 10 minutes. So thank you, Isaac, first of all. Today, I will be speaking about the Epistle of Barnabas and the First Epistle of Clement. These two works, key texts of the modern corpus known as the Apostolic Fathers, have a few things in common which separate them from others in this collection. For example, we do not know who wrote them. The ascription to Barnabas is universally rejected. The first letter of Clement is deemed authentic, except that it never mentions Clement or identify him as a sender or say anything at all about his personal life. And everything we know about Clement of Rome is, apart from this letter, is legendary. So authentic in this case seems to refer to the Sitzim Leben, an ecclesiastical scandal that has broken out in Corinth. So authentic or not, the work is anonymous. This is important to me because the very anonymity makes a within Judaism reading of these two works possible. We know early Christian authorities like Ignatius of Antioch and Justin of Neapolis were Gentiles who did not identify as Jews. But for Barnabas and Clement, we don't know how the authors identified themselves. Neither uses the terms Christian or Jew, although both speak about Israel and are the only apostolic fathers to do so. We should wonder then why Barnabas and Clement were chosen as the pseudonymous authors of these letters in the first place. Barnabas was a Jew by birth, a Levite, and an associate of Paul, who, according to Acts and Galatians, had heated disagreements with him, including over Gentile observance of the Jewish law. Clement, often identified with the person of that name in Philippians, is traditionally associated with Peter as his traveling companion and his eventual successor as Bishop of Rome. According to the romance written in his name, Clement was a Gentile who converted to Peter's brand of Christ-believing Judaism. The word Christian is never used there. Their first encounter was mediated by one Barnabas, presumably Paul's former companion. Early readers of these letters attributed them to men, therefore, who are either religiously or ethnically Jewish. One might suppose that this is because, and here is another link between them, they are littered with citations and allusions to the Hebrew Bible in its Greek version, including references to deuterocanonical and unknown works. Clement has the earliest reference to the Book of Wisdom, probably, and Judith, certainly, while Barnabas features stray allusions to Enoch and two anonymous references to what might be Second Baruch and 4 Ezra. And in fact, this is the reason I'm interested in them, not because I come from the appropriate background. Neither work cites the New Testament, although Clement, who is writing from Rome to the Corinthians, is clearly cognizant of Paul's first letter to this community and is likely aware of others, especially to the Romans. Both are also aware of diverse traditions about Jesus and the apostles. Their knowledge and interest in the Hebrew scriptures, however, is unparalleled among the apostolic fathers, some of whom, like Ignatius, seem almost indifferent to the earlier scriptures. For the same reason, one suspects Barnabas and Clement have been offered in ancient testimony, that is, by Origen and Tertullian, as potential authors of the book, the so-called Epistle to the Hebrews. Knowledge of the scriptures is not the same as being within Judaism, as the case of Justin shows. Indeed, both of these letters are generally considered to have been written by Gentiles for Gentiles. My understanding of the within Judaism perspective is that it is a corrective to the 19th century tendency of defining Jewish Christianity, whatever that might mean, as essentially anti-Paulinism. Neither of these letters, however, is anti-Pauline. Clement heralds the apostles' martyrdom and references 1 Corinthians. Barnabas does not mention Paul, but he has comparable positions on the value and limitations of the Jewish law. Comparable, I say, but not identical, since Paul teaches that Gentiles should not be circumcised, while Barnabas teaches that circumcision is a satanic perversion. So slight differences. Yet another link between the two is that, unlike many of the apostolic fathers, first Clement and Barnabas are both found among the oldest Greek biblical manuscripts. Both epistles to Clement are found in the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus, where they follow the Apocalypse of John and constitute the only apostolic fathers in the manuscript. Similarly, the Epistle of Barnabas is found next to the Shepherd of Hermas in Codex Sinaiticus. This, along with the manner in which they are cited by early church fathers, is indicative of their authority. We can imagine a world where both works became part of the New Testament. For the rest of my presentation, then, I would like to pose a thought experiment. What would that world look like? The operating hypothesis of the within Judaism perspective seems to be, can we consider the New Testament a Christian canon of Jewish books? So I'd like to apply that to first Clement and Barnabas. In what way can we consider these books Jewish? I'll start with Clement. The letter was written in Rome. Paul's famous epistle to the Romans addresses a Gentile community, but Rome is also generally considered to be the intended recipient of the epistle to the Hebrews. In any case, Clement seems to know Hebrews. As mentioned above, Clement does not use Christian, Jew, or any derivative term. He and his addressees belong to the ecclesia of God, which you could define as a church, or traditionally church, but also assembly or community. He invokes Jesus Christ throughout the letter, whom he addresses as Lord, but not as Son of God, although in a prayer at the end he calls Jesus a servant, the Pais of God. His Christology was insufficient from the perspective of the 9th century Byzantine patriarch Photios, who writes, "The author deserves censure for calling our Lord Jesus Christ chief priest and president, not even using the loftier terms that befit God, although he nowhere openly blasphemes." On Jewish matters, Clement talks little of the present but a great deal about the past. His examples of model behavior are predominantly from the Hebrew scriptures and include figures such as Judith, who now appears in a datable record for the first time. So we don't have Jewish attestations of Judith. We have her here in Clement. And again, this is my precise interest in this letter. What kind of early Christian communities were reading books like Judith or 4 Ezra or 2 Baruch? He also views the ecclesiastical hierarchy as parallel to the Jewish priesthood. Unlike Hebrews, he does not speak of earlier institutions as shadows or types of present realities. Now, the argument here depends a great deal on what is not said. Justin, though probably not Ignatius, could have written many of the same things as Clement. The point is that we do not have enough evidence to arbitrate, so we are left in a fog. And if we cannot even tell whether a work is Jewish or Christian, what does that tell us about the alleged parting of the ways? Barnabas presents a very different set of data, but leads me to essentially the same conclusion. Again, he never uses the terms Jewish or Christian. Like many today, however, he has a preferred set of pronouns, and they are us and them. They are descendants of carnal Israel. They circumcise their sons. They keep the Sabbath. They observe kashrut. We, however, circumcise our hearts. We allegorize the dietary laws, and we are not worthy to celebrate the Sabbath, so we observe Sunday instead. This rhetoric has made Barnabas a primary witness to the parting of the ways debate. However, it requires assigning the terms Jewish and Christian to the two sides, which Barnabas resists. They are undoubtedly Jews. Everything he cites is a marker of Jewish identity. But who are we? The standard supersessionist argument is that after the crucifixion, the promises to Israel were transferred from Jews to Christians, Gentile Christians, and the Mosaic law is no longer relevant. And this is the kind of argument you find in Justin Martyr. Barnabas, however, does not claim Israel as a mantle for his community, as the Gentile church would later do. Instead, he castigates historical Israel for its sins, the most prominent of which is not the crucifixion, but the making of the golden calf. At the same time, he wants to maintain, so the rejection of Israel seems like a smoking gun, but at the same time, he wants to maintain the ongoing validity of the law, although understand in its proper, and for him, metaphorical sense. It is actually the obverse of the typical arguments. His allegories are reminiscent of the practice among some Hellenistic Jews. So we have typical examples like Aristeas, who interprets the food laws in metaphorical terms, and of course Philo of Alexandria. But in addition to his own exegetical project, Philo complains of Jews who have gone too far in allegorizing the law and consequently have become lax in its observance. And I have trouble seeing how this differs terribly from Barnabas' own position, except that he adds Jesus to it. Barnabas is more extreme than all of these examples, but he still considers himself to be law observant. Standard supersessionist arguments promulgated by the imperial church view the death of Jesus as a turning point in salvation history and a radical break with the past. Both Clement and Barnabas, however, argue for continuity, the continuity of Israelite history in the assembly of God, so Clement, and the continuity of the law given at Sinai, which has not been replaced, but rather clarified, which is the position of Barnabas. Both epistles can be read into the supersessionist narrative, but they can also be read apart from it, as is the case for many of the canonical books of the New Testament. And that's all the thoughts I'm willing to share. Now I have more of them. I also have many more gaps in my knowledge, but I think I've gone long enough. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gavin. Excellent presentation, and I hope we can come back to some of the points and other points that you discussed and didn't discuss. Let us move on then to next presenter, Jason Morav, also is going to touch on Barnabas and deal with Ignatius.
Thank you, Gabriele, Isaac, Megan, and the attendees of the conference for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to spend most of my time with Ignatius, but I'll touch on Barnabas and have some similar things to say as Gavin. But today I want to briefly reflect on these texts and whether they belong within Judaism or whether they can be read as Jewish texts. In a word, no. Ignatius and Barnabas take significant steps toward the emergence of Christianity as distinct religious systems from Judaism and Christians as a distinct people than Jews, or in Barnabas's case, even Israel. by presenting a self-understanding that goes beyond the New Testament writings. I don't think we're not at Justin Martyr yet, but we're a step beyond what the New Testament does on our way to Justin. Ignatius and Barnabas begin to construct an explicitly distinct identity, which Ignatius explicitly terms Christian, in contrast to Judaism, and Barnabas contrasts with Israel, as Gavin talked about. They self-identify their group as not that group, whether termed Judaism or Israel. These groups are different in practices, beliefs, and identity. Ignatius and Barnabas thus represent a salvation historically justified progression from Judaism to Christianism, to use Ignatius's term, and they're starting to become distinct traditions by use of this what I think is some of the clearest othering rhetoric and self-definition, certainly that we've seen to, I think, this point in time. So to show this, I want to consider the last question of this conference prompt first, and ask the question, what would change if we were to read the writings of Ignatius and Barnabas within Judaism? In fact, is it even possible to do so? Do they let us do that? So I want to entertain this thought experiment by applying common within Judaism logic, namely that these texts are concerned with internecine, in-house disputes about the Jesus movement and its direction and the traditions movement. And they're not criticizing Judaism or Jews in totality, but they're navigating some fluid social boundaries between Jews and Jesus followers at this time. And I think doing so, entertaining this thought experiment, one, helps us engage Ignatius's writings and the Epistle of Barnabas without presuming an anti-Jewish bias, without presupposing a supersessionism on their part, to consider in their own voices, do they let us read them as Jewish texts? And nevertheless, I suggest that even with these assumptions and logic, Ignatius and Barnabas will outright refuse to stay within Judaism, or for Barnabas to stay within Israel, and be categorized as such. So I want to start and focus on Ignatius's letter to the Magnesians. Some have argued that Judaism for Ignatius is an internal other, not an external one. So in other words, the Judaism that he's criticizing is either Jewish forms of Jesus following or Judaizing forms of Jesus following, perhaps Gentiles adopting Jewish identity and practice, similar to what Paul is opposing in his letters. And that Ignatius is from Antioch, the place where, according to Acts, this issue arises and sparks the Jerusalem Council. We also get the first use of the term Christian there, reinforces this possibility. And if in this reading, Ignatius's target would not be Jews or Judaism wholesale, but those who advocate and practice the adoption of Torah, perhaps for Gentiles specifically. And I think that this does fit the first 7 chapters of Magnesians and even the opening chapters of Philadelphians, the other epistle that deals with Judaism, because Ignatius in those chapters focuses on the salvific work of Christ. He commends ecclesial unity, gathering together as one body, and exhorts submission to the overseer. So it's not unreasonable to see Ignatius's reasoning and concerns extending Paul's own regarding Gentile Judaizing for the sake of unity. And like Paul, he wants his community to gather at the same time together under the authority of the overseer as, quote, one temple of God and as on one altar, Magnesians 7:2. But regardless, Ignatius's rhetoric then moves well beyond Paul's. After this exhortation, he writes, do not be deceived by erroneous teachings, heterodoxies, or worthless antiquated myths. For if we are living according to Judaism, until now, we confess to not having received grace. For the most godly prophets lived according to Christ Jesus. As Judith Liu memorably quips, Ignatius opposes not law and grace, but Judaism and grace. Whatever Judaism is for Ignatius, it contrasts with living according to Jesus. The biblical prophets for Ignatius exemplify this contrast. They lived according to Christ, not Judaism. Ignatius's emphasis on living according to suggests that he's not merely contrasting beliefs, but practices associated with conflicting ways of life. Even if Judaism is an in-house issue for Ignatius, which I do think is possible, He does recognize the presence of Jews within the ecclesia at the beginning of Smyrnaeans 1-2. He contrasts Jesus' following from the way of life associated with the people known as Judaioi. His rhetoric inevitably has a more totalizing effect. And so Ignatius makes explicit the opposition between patterns of behavior soon after this passage. He describes how, quote, those who were living in antiquated practices came into newness of hope. Here he's presumably referring to Jews who turned to Jesus, probably the apostles, and continues saying they were no longer observing the Sabbath, but living according to the Lord's day. Ignatius even continues saying, therefore, having become disciples, let us learn to live according to Christianism. For whoever is called by any other name than this one does not belong to God. So the Antiochian Ignatius adopts the epithet outsiders seemingly first attributed to Jesus' followers in Antioch, namely Christian, which he explicitly uses in Magnesians 4:1 for his group, as the only name that identifies God's people. Ignatius will then conclude this section writing, therefore, throw out the bad yeast, which has become antiquated and soured, and reach for the new yeast, which is Jesus Christ. Be salted with him so that someone among you might not become rotten, for by your odor you will be convicted. It is absurd to profess Jesus Christ and to Judaize, for Christianism did not become faithful to Judaism, but Judaism to Christianism, in which every tongue believed and was gathered to God. So observe Ignatius's salvation historical logic here. Judaism is the old yeast to be cast aside in favor of the new yeast, Christ, or Christianism. Judaism has believed in Christianism, not vice versa. The Jewish apostles believed in Jesus, but Jesus' followers did not adopt Jewish practices. Those were seemingly left behind. So to return to Judaism, or if this is an in-house conversation for Ignatius, to add Judaism to Christ's faith, to add Jewish practices to Christ's faith, contravenes God's activity in Christ and his new community. So for him, it seems Judaism should be a thing of the past. And though Ignatius knows the Magnesians have not fallen prey to this, he certainly thinks Judaism is something worth warning them about. And so Ignatius draws new borders by coining the term Christianism in direct contrast to Judaism. Christianism for him is not Judaism. Judaism is antithetical to it. So if Ignatius targets a group of Christ believers, portraying them as heterodox or heretical, this still has implications for his conceptions of Jews outside of the ecclesia, namely that Christians are not them in belief, name, or practice. They're incommensurable. So I think the thought experiment fails. It is absurd to profess Ignatius within Judaism. Now, as Gavin, I think, has shown, it seems easier to read the Epistle of Barnabas within Judaism. Indeed, it very well could be that the author, whoever that might be, is Jewish, given his substantial knowledge of Israel's scripture, his deep valuing of the law. Regardless, Barnabas's reasoning is deeply indebted to and committed to Israel's scriptures and their formative role. But as Gavin pointed out, Barnabas famously allegorizes the Torah to the point of irrelevancy at best, and importantly, the result of an evil angel's influence at worst, at least when it comes to circumcision. So we could suggest that Barnabas does stand in the line of the Jews who allegorize Torah to the exclusion of tangible practices that Philo criticizes, but it's Barnabas's demonization of these practices that indicates an antagonism that goes a step beyond. Indeed, he refers to those people who hold to things like physical circumcision, literal sacrifice, and actual food laws, and he refers to them as being ignorant and disobedient. And so I think herein lies Barnabas's refusal to be categorized within Judaism, or at least within Israel. He explicitly denies any covenantal identity to Israel, and he defines his group in contrast to them, warning his readers not to be like, quote, certain people piling up your sins saying that our covenant remains. But these people have lost it completely in this way, just when Moses received it. So in other words, Israel went astray, and they were not worthy to receive the covenant because of their sins. They remain unworthy. As he writes in 11:1, now concerning the water, It is written with reference to Israel that they would never accept the baptism that brings forgiveness of sin, but would create a substitute for themselves. So Barnabas expressly contrasts Israel with this new people of God, whom Jesus has prepared to inherit the promises given to the patriarchs. So he does see himself in the legacy of the ancestral promises, but he does not claim the identity of Israel. He seems to push that away. We are God's people, they are not. Israel has, to use his own words in 4:14, have been left behind. And while he doesn't add a new epithet for his group like Ignatius, he still fosters this we are not them form of reasoning. This new people is not or self-identification. So in conclusion, Ignatius and Barnabas take a significant step toward the developing of a Christianity that is not Judaism. Even privileging charitable interpretations and presupposing intramural conflict, this explicit othering, this we are not them approach of Ignatius and Barnabas betray a refusal to stay within Judaism. Ignatius's Christianism is just incommensurable with Judaism, whether this refers to Jewish or Judaizing forms of Jesus following, or the Jewish ancestral tradition broadly. Likewise, Barnabas says the covenant belongs to us, not them, the people of Israel. So to be sure, both draw from Israel's scriptures and what might be called Jewish forms of reasoning and are indebted to Jewish forms of reasoning, but common sources, common reasoning, and even a common genealogy are not particularly determinative for identifying a text within Judaism. Rather, I think self-definition vis-a-vis others is paramount. And Ignatius and Barnabas spark an irreversible shift in Christianism's self-understanding as not Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for that very insightful thought experiment of trying to read both Barnabas and Ignatius within Judaism. We're now turning to a different text, the Didache by Lutz Dering.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to Gabriele and to Isaac for the invitation to contribute, to present in the context of this virtual Enoch seminar conference, and also to Megan for the technical side. I'm happy to reconnect to the activities of the Enoch seminar after some time of abstention. But without further ado, I'll come to the question of whether it's meaningful to situate the Didache within Judaism or to read it within Judaism. And I've got a presentation which I would like to share. I hope that works. Just a moment. Can you see it?
Yes, if you could put it on full slideshow.
I'll do that. I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. Can it be seen? Yeah.
Yes.
So the Didache is a work containing sections belonging to different genres. It consists of ethical instruction in the form of a two-ways treatise, chapters 1 to 6, liturgical and practical instruction on baptism, fasting, prayer, and the Eucharist, chapters 7 to 10, rules for the community, chapters 11 to 15, and an eschatological apocalyptic coda, chapter 16. The text of the Didache, fragmentarily preserved on a 4th century papyrus, is extant in its entirety only in one Greek manuscript from 1056, named Hierosolymitanos 54, or H. It has also been included in later compositions such as the Apostolic Constitutions, Book 7. While it is difficult to date the Didache, the ideological proximity to the Gospel of Matthew, the limited development of offices, and the apparent presence of Jewish or Jewish Christian traditions speak for a date towards the end of the 1st century CE or around 100. That's at least the conventional wisdom. There are some outliers to this, of course. One key to the Didache might be its title. Manuscript H appears to deploy two titles, a short one and a long one. The short one is Teaching of the 12 Apostles, the long one, Teaching of the Lord through the 12 Apostles to the Gentiles. Scholars have debated which one, if any, is original. Several years ago, my Münster colleague Dietrich Alex Koch argued that the long title is not a title at all in Manuscript H, but rather the introduction to the two ways teaching. It is visibly set off from the title, which is framed by a tetracolon and a tricolon, while text from Didache 1.1, separated only by a semicolon, follows right away. And you can see this on the image here. Thus, Koch argues we ought to differentiate. The two ways are presented as a baptismal catechesis for people from a non-Jewish background, tois ethnicin, while the entire composition, bearing the short title, has a mixed Jewish and Gentile Christ-believing community in view. So, can such a text be deemed to be or to be meaningfully read within Judaism? The initial section, Didache 1 to 6, is itself composite. Into an originally Jewish two-ways treatise, the redactor has inserted a section reminiscent of gospel material and therefore called Sectio Evangelica. That's Didache 1 3b to 2.1. Without this material, the structure of the text is as follows. An introductory statement of the two ways, 1.1. The way of life explicated first by the commandment to love God, second by the commandment to love one's neighbor, and supplemented by the negative golden rule, 1.2. A further elaboration of the teaching regarding the latter, given in terms of commandments of the second Decalogue table and various other commandments, 2.2 to 4.14. The way of death, chapter 5, explicated in detail, and then finally a conclusion, 6.1 to 3, which was modified by the redactor of the Didache, and I'll come back to this presently. This is clearly a text coming out of a Judean Jewish tradition of ethical instruction. For example, one might compare Psalm 1, Deuteronomy 30, 4 Ezra 7, 2 Baruch 19, and 46, and other passages. It has been suggested that the two ways adopted by the Didachists have already been slightly Christianized because they feature the double love commandment in connection with the negative golden rule. The claim here is that the double love commandment is not attested before the Synoptic Gospels, Mark 12 and parallels. There are, however, Jewish texts coming close to such a double commandment, Philo, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and Jubilees, you see them here on the slide. It is therefore generally conceivable that both the Synoptic Gospels and the two ways doctrine in the Didache share in an early Jewish coupling of the love of the commandment or commandments to love God and one's fellow, which can be rephrased in terms of the golden rule, which is also the case, for example, in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan on Leviticus 19:18, where the golden rule is kind of an explication of the commandment of love, of loving one's fellow. Similarly, the Decalogue commandments in Didache 2.2, supplemented by further social norms, are a potential exploration of the love commandment in terms of the second table of the Decalogue. Now, the insertion of the Sectio Evangelica does not make this a Christian as opposed to a Jewish text. We see in this section some resemblance with material usually attributed to Q, especially the Sermon on the Mount. And I've given you the first verse of that Sectio Evangelica, with scholars being divided whether the Didachist knew Luke, Matthew, both, or none of them. Certainly, he deemed both the Jewish and the gospel-style material congenial. The conclusion to the two ways has probably been reductionally rephrased by the Didachist as follows. That's Didache 6:2 to 3. For if you are able to bear the whole yoke of the Lord, you will be perfect. But if you are not able, then do what you can. Now concerning food, bear what you are able, but from meat sacrificed to idols, keep strictly away, for it is worship of dead gods. As I've argued elsewhere, the whole yoke of the Lord is most likely the Torah as interpreted by Christ the Lord, since, as we have seen, the Lord in the introduction to the two ways doctrine, teaching of the Lord, refers to Christ, not to God. This is thus a stance similar to that in the Gospel of Matthew, which as Jesus set out his Torah interpretation of the so-called antitheses, and at the end of this section calls the addressees to be perfect, Matthew 5:48. Regarding food laws, the Didache espouses an approach different from both Paul and the apostolic decree in Acts 15. It appears to take a more proactive approach than Paul in insisting on strictly keeping away lian proseche from meat sacrificed to idols. However, of the abstentions of the decree, the Didache mentions only idol meat. Sexual transgression is dealt with in Didache 2.2, 3.3, 5.1, so might therefore have been left out here. But blood consumption and strangled meat are not mentioned specifically here. One might argue that blood and nevelah are out of question anyway for people coming from Jewish sensitivities, but thus by not mentioning them explicitly, the text would follow Jewish assumptions. In addition, and notably, the Didaches bear what you can would also include further food items not covered by the apostolic decree, such as non-kosher meat, to be avoided as much as possible. The maxim to bear what they can thus seems to take for granted that non-Jewish Christ believers keep specific notions of Torah as far as possible. However, the text does not state explicitly whether Jewish Christ believers would undergo baptism too, which they might, and if so, what kind of catechesis they would receive. That's the consequence of assigning 1 to 6 only to non-Jewish, to Gentile Christ believers. So we don't know exactly what Jewish Christ believers, how they would be instructed. Moreover, Didache 8:1 states, "Let your fasts not be together with the hypocrites, for they fast on Monday and Thursday. You, however, should fast on Wednesday and Friday." What we know about the practice of Jewish fasting in the first century, I've written about this also in another contribution, does not point to fasts uniformly observed by the Jews on these 2 days. Rather, this was initially a voluntary practice ascribed particularly to Pharisees, see for example Luke 18:12, fasting twice a week, and later became connected with the market days on Monday and Thursday, initially still as individual fast. Similarly, the wording in the Didache points to a specific group targeted as the hypocrites, over against a Jewish group probably bearing some resemblance to and relation with the Pharisees. The Didache ordains a competing day for the fasts of individuals in the milieu envisioned by this text. We find a similar procedure regarding prayer. Didache 8:2-3 reads, "Nor should you pray like the hypocrites. Instead, pray like this, just as the Lord commanded in his gospel," and follows the Lord's Prayer. "Pray like this 3 times a day." I suggest that the Didache's advice is directed against efforts by the same group called hypocrites, not the Jews in general, and that we see here a reflection of the origins of the obligatory thrice daily prayer after 70 CE. Recent scholarship on the 18 benedictions has suggested that fixed obligatory prayer was an innovation in the time span between the late 1st and about the middle of the 2nd century CE, building on earlier formulae and showing textual fluidity into late antiquity. In short, we suggest seeing in Didache 8:2-3 a competition with the beginnings of the developing thrice daily Amidah prayer coming out of a particular community, not of shared by all Jews at that time, but a particular community, the hypocrites, with which this community addressed in Didache is in competition. The Didache further knows of a Eucharist, chapters 9 and 14, with grace after meal, chapter 10, the Lord's Day, chapter 14, Apostles and Prophets, chapters 11-13, and Episkopoi as well as Diakonoi, chapter 15. But we ought to be careful not to take these as evidence for a Christ-believing group fully separate from Judaism. Some elements, such as the Eucharistic prayers and grace after meal, are similar to Jewish prayer, while even seemingly Christian elements, such as the Eucharist as sacrifice, Thesia, resemble Jewish attempts to replace temple sacrifice. I'm coming to a conclusion. Reading the Didache within Judaism might mean to read it as relating to a group partly including Jews and practicing a form of Torah interpreted in line with Jesus' tradition and/or the Synoptic Gospels, in a situation prior to a clear-cut parting of the ways. The Gentile members of this group are encouraged to bear what they are able to practice in relation to this form of the Torah. We don't know what about the Jewish members. The text displays clear attempts at differentiating the group addressed from other Jewish varieties labeled the hypocrites, probably Pharisees or their successors. There is no evidence of a parting of the ways as already implemented. The rhetoric of the text attempting to erect boundaries suggests quite the contrary. The Didache thus might be read within Judaism, a differentiated, variegated Judaism to be sure, but as a Christ-believing, Gentiles-inclusive form, probably with baptism for all its members, and attempting to establish fast days and communal prayers of its own. This might be seen as ultimately gravitating beyond Judaism. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. It's so many intriguing texts and interesting presentations in this panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Let us move now to yet a different text, The Shepherd of Hermas by Angela Kim Harkins.
Okay. Hi, I just want to add my thanks and appreciation to the organizers. I know it takes a lot of time to pull together such a huge group of people, and I think it's really been very profitable given the observations that have been made at the end of each day. So I'm really grateful to be a part of this. When I was invited to be part of this webinar conference, I was asked to think about the Shepherd of Hermas within or without ancient Judaism, and to reflect on the criteria that I would use to determine my answer to this question, and what are the possible changes that would happen to our understanding of Hermas if we were to think of it within a Jewish context. I really appreciate these questions, and I think they're very, very appropriate. I also want to begin with just some general overview comments about the Shepherd of Hermas. It is probably the longest work, right, in the Apostolic Fathers collection. It has 3 parts. We have the 5 visions in the Book of Visions, 12 mandates, which is the second part, and the similitudes or parables, 10 of those. While the work is named after this figure named Hermas, the protagonist, he does not reappear by name after the Book of Visions. In Vision 5 of the Book of Visions, we're introduced to the character, the shepherd, or the angel of repentance, who then continues on after. So Hermas, our protagonist, we get a very sort of colorful sense of his personality and his type of character early in the Book of Visions, throughout his various exchanges with his visionary interlocutors. And then after the 5th vision, we really perhaps preserve that first person narration, and the implicit character of Hermas continues, perhaps, but he's never named. We know that early Christians were aware of the Shepherd of Hermas and that it was very popular. We have a number of ancient manuscript copies of the shepherd, and I think it's notable that the majority of these come from North Africa. So while we see some references to Rome in the shepherd, it's really not clear how popular this text was, circulating among Romans or being used in Rome itself. I think the very often cited fresco of Catacomb in Naples, Italy, certainly probably doesn't help us to get a fuller sense, but that is something I suppose worth noting there. We do know that individuals refer to the Shepherd of Hermas, especially in North Africa, and the majority of our manuscripts of this text come from Oxyrhynchus, which is located near the Nile River. And perhaps, of course, like most things, this is by accident because of the climate of North Africa, in contrast to the climate in Rome. But we see that Tertullian in Carthage makes reference to the shepherd. He has some very strong feelings, of course, about the Shepherd of Hermas, speaking strongly against it and calling it an adulterous teaching. So his views on the shepherd seems to have changed. And this is largely due to its teaching about a second repentance. And the shepherd is also mentioned by other North Africans, Clement, Origen, his student Didymus the blind. For example, these are figures that attest to the popularity of the shepherd, and these are figures who know about the Shepherd of Hermas. As was mentioned earlier by our presenters on the Epistle of Barnabas, the shepherd was there with the Epistle of Barnabas. We see it in the Codex Sinaiticus. So it's very popular text. I want to return to Oxyrhynchus and some of that when we think about the Jewish context, but I want to begin with some discussion of are there any internal features in the shepherd that suggest a Jewish author or a kind of Jewish literary context. So the Shepherd makes allusions to passages or ideas that are familiar to us from the Septuagint, for example, oftentimes using imagery without quoting from the Septuagint. So we might think about that as kind of a general observation, the wisdom of Solomon, for example, Proverbs, Sirach, the Psalms. These are, and Isaiah, of course, these are sort of images of stone, the stone or cornerstone, double-heartedness, false prophets, discussions of fasting, the two ways, things of that nature. So, the text, the shepherd is not quoting per se as we might expect, but oftentimes scholars describe it as sort of reworking or rephrasing a sort of Septuagintal phrasing or language. We do have a reference in Vision 4, Hermas. This is that memorable scene of Hermas walking on a dusty, dusty road during a very hot day, seeing an enormous wild beast. He says something like a sea monster. This particular word for sea monster, ketos, is the same word used in the Septuagint to refer to Jonah's whale, or found in the book of Job to Rahab. So, with respect to the imagery, it's not explicit reference to the Septuagint, but certainly allusions to this text. Notably, the shepherd does not have any clear reference to Jesus, his life, his ministry, his death, resurrection. There's none of that. While it does mention baptism, specifically this idea of post-baptismal sin, which is probably the most famous, maybe doctrinal context for, and certainly the cause of Tertullian's anger against this text. There's no reference to other sort of things that we associate with Christianity, like the Eucharist, for example. So we don't have any clear reference to Jesus Christ by name. There's no sort of Christological discussion. While you have this context of baptism or second repentance, so to speak, it doesn't have any other sort of reference to like a Eucharist or any kind of scene of that nature. Instead, the shepherd uses phrases like Son of God instead of any sort of explicit language about Jesus or Christ or anything like that. There's also an interesting reference to what is, of course, a lost Jewish pseudepigraphon known as the Book of Eldad and Medad, or I think in the Greek it's Eldad and Modad. And Eldad and Medad are two characters from the book of Numbers, chapter 11, who are named as prophesying outside the camp. So this is the scene when Joshua is complaining to Moses, and Moses vindicates them by saying, would it be that all of Israel should prophesy? He sort of is not bothered by this in the same way. But Eldad and Medad are two named figures. Who knows why this particular Jewish pseudepigraphon, which is now lost, is cited. Hermas's identity or his fictive identity as a former slave, and perhaps the wilderness wanderings of those who were recently enslaved in Egypt, perhaps that has some narratival connection, but it's not really clear what that larger work is, perhaps a set of lost prophecies. So what other evidence do we have for situating Hermas within an ancient Jewish context? Here, I want to go back to our discussion of Oxyrhynchus. This was the home of a vibrant Jewish community. It's south of Cairo. And during the first 2 centuries, we know that it was a very vibrant Jewish community that had been sort of severely impacted by the response to the Jewish revolt in 115, 117, the Common Era. So, we also know that there are certain Jews who are referenced or cited from Oxyrhynchus. And while it is thought that this Jewish community was extinguished, I think it's better to think of it as, it persisting even after the diminishment of its size, because we know that there was in the late 3rd century an affluent Jewish slave woman and her child, and she is said to have been, sort of ransomed from slavery by this synagogue. So there must have been some ongoing Jewish presence here in Oxyrhynchus. So we don't have much documentary remains of actual Jews from Oxyrhynchus because, we also know that the original excavators of Oxyrhynchus, Grenfell and Hunt, they really had no concern to preserve or to record any material remains of past Jewish communities. Their focus was really on sort of thinking about the origins of the Christian presence in this region. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And so it, just to re-emphasize or just to emphasize that most of our oldest manuscripts of the Shepherd come from Oxyrhynchus, a place that has this historic context of this large and vibrant Jewish community. Hermas, when we look even more closely at the literary sort of the visions, for example, Hermas sort of behaves similarly as we might expect in different visionary texts, patiently seeking some kind of understanding from the visions that he experiences. I think this question, what would change if we thought about Hermas within Judaism more explicitly and less explicitly as a Christian catechetical work? I think we would appreciate some different things about Hermas that have been overlooked. So, for example, instead of thinking it as a kind of Christian sort of ethical manual or catechetical sort of set of teachings, seeing the shepherd a little bit more within that apocalyptic and paranetic continuum, I think that would be quite striking. The shepherd has had a sort of, people have not wanted to think of the shepherd within an apocalyptic context because it doesn't have a strong eschatological horizon. It doesn't have these themes of journeying. But I think if we were to consider maybe the absence of a lot of distinctively Christian elements in the shepherd, perhaps those details might help us to acknowledge it within a larger continuum of ancient Jewish writings, so to speak. It does seem that the text was quite popular in that region of Oxyrhynchus. It also, I don't think we can put a whole lot of diagnostic information, but I just point out that many of those early copies of the Shepherd were copied on book rolls, and so that too, I think, is striking. I think it is something like by the 3rd century, the great majority of Christian texts or writings the preference is strongly in the direction of codices, but the Shepherd sort of persists in being copied in this book roll format. I don't think we can say a whole lot about that particular aspect, but it is an interesting thing to observe in that sense. So I think for me, because, as scholars of this time period, we are so heavily focused on genre, on literary texts, and things like that. I think expanding our horizon about the shepherd as being part of this ancient idea of Judaism, broadly defined, I think really does help us to move our more rigid genre expectations in a different direction and in ways that I think are very helpful. So I hope that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela, for that. Looking forward to further discussion. Let's move on. We have now yet another text, The Gospel of Thomas by Yoon Lim.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Vermont, Middlebury, Vermont. Thank you to Professor Oliver and also the organizers for inviting me to speak on this wonderful panel. And speaking about the Gospel of Thomas within 10 minutes is such a daunting task, but I'll try my best. So let me share my PowerPoint here. Okay, so there you go. Okay. So, in terms of the first question about why Thomas should or should not be placed within Judaism, I'd like to point out that there is an important difference between saying that Thomas is a Jewish gospel versus saying that Thomas should be read within Judaism. So the first is about the text's religious identity, and the second about how we interpret it. For several reasons, some obvious, some less so, we maybe shouldn't just call Thomas a Jewish text. But what I want to emphasize today is this. We can't really understand Thomas unless we place it in the context of Judaism, especially within Hellenistic Judaism. So I'll come back to this point a little later. But for now, let me give a quick overview of the key debates around Thomas, and since they really shape how we answer the question about its relationship to Judaism and also helps us formulate our own answer to the second question about the determining criteria. Because of Thomas's importance for understanding the Jesus tradition and Christian origins, scholars have long and hotly debated three things: its provenance, its date, and how it relates to the Synoptic Gospels. Some North American scholars, they argue for an Aramaic origin if we think about the provenance first, or at least in an earlier form of the Gospel of Thomas, could be rooted in an Aramaic-speaking Palestine, likely Jerusalem. And then some of these scholars said that maybe the Thomas community later was relocated to Syria. And these scholars tend to date Thomas earlier than later, so like in the mid-1st century CE. Then there are other scholars, pointed to Syria, especially Edessa in Upper Mesopotamia. This has been the more traditional view supported by many scholars, even though they do not necessarily agree on the earlier date of Thomas. And also this is also because of the strong presence of Thomas in Syria. But more recently, younger generation of scholars, they think that Thomas probably originated from Alexandria, Egypt, especially based upon Thomas's literary parallels with other works originating from Alexandria, or considering Alexandria's Judeo-Hellenistic intellectual milieu, with which Thomas shows a lot of affinities. So these arguments often go along with the later dates, so around 140 CE. So now provenance and dating are not just the side questions, they are loaded. The closer Thomas is to Jerusalem, the earlier we date it, the easier it is to situate it within Judaism. With that in mind, some scholars even speculate that at least some of the sayings in Thomas could be attributed back to the historical Jesus. But if, on the other hand, if we think Thomas came later, then it looks more like a text separated from Judaism. Or possibly we can imagine a Greek-speaking diasporic Jew as the author and engaging in a mission similar to Paul's, but not theologically similar to Paul's. So here's another layer. Does Thomas predate or postdate the Synoptics? And how close is it to Q, the hypothetical source behind Matthew and Luke? Depending on your answers, Thomas either lines up with the Jesus movement in Palestine, or it stands apart from Judaism altogether. Those who date Thomas at a later date see its dependence on the synoptics, and so they tend to highlight Thomas as an anti-Jewish and more solely Christian text. And in terms of textual traditions, we have 3 Greek fragments that were found Oxyrhynchus. I'm glad that Dr. Hawkins talked about Oxyrhynchus. And then these fragments, they predate the Nag Hammadi discovery in the 4th century. So 4th century document. These fragments contain partial sayings from Thomas and are dated to the mid to late 2nd century. And later, the Coptic version we now have was translated from Greek into Sahidic Coptic. Since Thomas's sayings collection, Logois Saphon, and given the fragmentary nature of the Greek evidence, it's reasonable to assume the text evolved over time and went through significant editing. In other words, some sayings could be dated early, but we cannot assume that the entire collection of those 114 sayings is to be dated similarly. So this raises the question, how much does our complete Coptic version reflect the original ideas? When we talk about Thomas and Judaism, are we talking about the 4th century or 5th century Coptic Thomas, read and preserved by a Christian monastic community in Egypt? Or are we assuming that the current copy we have still represents pretty much of the earlier form and ideas? So these are really huge questions. So that's why on my slide, I summarized this way. Depending on how you answer these questions, Thomas is Jewish Christian, or Coptic Christian. So nevertheless, in terms of Thomas's place within Judaism, some may immediately respond to me saying that Thomas should not be within Judaism due to its seemingly anti-Jewish sayings, or at least its critical view of traditional Jewish religious practices. However, if we just take a step back and then read these sayings a little more carefully, the anti-Jewish sentiment in this gospel can be understood less severe than what it appears to be. So for the time being, let's briefly check these sayings about fasting, almsgiving, dietary law and purity regulation, and prayers. So I tried to highlight some keywords here on the slide, as you can see. But here, although Thomas's Jesus seems to prohibit these practices, if we approach them similarly to what we usually do with Paul, these practices can be understood as, these sayings can be understood as exhortations given to new, possibly Gentile proselytes, for whom these community rules or Jewish practices can be deemed unnecessary. Or another possibility is that those ethnic Jews who left their original Jewish communities and then joined in this new Jesus movement, they might regard not observing these practices formally as their new religious identity marker. And another interesting aspect here, metaphorical understanding of these practices. As you can see, for example, in a true circumcision, Jesus states here, that reminds us of circumcision of the heart, Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 29. And going all the way back to Jeremiah, as you know, who says to Israel, circumcise your heart in chapter 4, verse 4, and criticizing Israel's uncircumcision in heart, as we see in Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. And then what about fasting from the world in Logion 27? Fasting from the world here aligns very well with Thomas's overall religious character, reflecting its world-denying and ascetic lifestyle. So it's taking up the Jewish practice as a metaphor here to advocate more his theological position. And then here comes the Sabbath. Here, this is not a Sabbath, you just, listeners and readers, need to habitually observe. But against this, more formalistic observance of the Sabbath, Thomas Jesus, talks about the Sabbath as a reminder for the beginning, the seventh day, when God rested. So just reminding the readers of the primordial state of the human being and also God's rest, Thomas uses Sabbath as a metaphor to emphasize its theological idea in what we call protology. For the time being, I'll only briefly mention the Pharisees and Jews here on this slide. But here, even though we do have mention of Pharisees twice and then one mention of scribes, they are not necessarily placed in a really harsh polemical position like the intra-Pharisee group conflict we can see in the Gospel of Matthew. It's quite different from that. Pharisees and teachers, they do not appear as persecutors of this Thomasine community. Rather, they are used as religious leaders. Then Jewish people, who are supposed to teach the truth about the kingdom of God and then true knowledge, but who actually failed to do so. So, in other words, probably the Gospel of Thomas is not as polemical as Matthew or John in relation to Jews or its understanding of the Jewish people. So let's talk about the third question then. What changes when the Gospel of Thomas is read within Judaism? So I'd like to briefly touch upon Thomas's theology, which I believe should be read within Judaism, like I mentioned in the beginning. So many scholars, not just myself, many scholars, see strong Middle Platonistic ideas within in Thomas, which is quite similar to Philo and also other contemporaneous authors at the time. And these Platonizing sentiments are found both in Syria and Alexandria. And in the Gospel of Thomas, we do not see apocalyptic eschatology, even though some sayings can be put in the apocalyptic sayings. It's more in a form critical observation. And for example, in a Platonic idea of the soul's journey back to God is taken up here. And so recovering one's original oneness, becoming a single one, and becoming like God, monad, the essence of God. These Platonic ideas, are really prevalent throughout the Gospel of Thomas. And not to mention that, salvation is understood as, recovering the one's original divine light within oneself. That's, how you should know yourself. But for the time being, let me show you just one logion here. The logion which I love, very puzzling. Okay, logion 22. Here we see this quite enigmatic saying about the kingdom of God, entering God's kingdom. And when Jesus' disciples, said to Jesus, then shall we enter the Father's kingdom as babies? Jesus says that when you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the blah, 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 and then when you make male and female into single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female to be female. So many scholars have long argued that this reminds us of Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, primordial human being created according to God's image. And then, as you all know, there's a phrase, male and female, God created him, the humanity, so it could be the representative of the whole human race. But just going back to this state, maybe non-gendered or androgynous. There are a lot of debate about this, but anyhow, this just recovering this original state in non-gendered or pre-gendered state of the first human being. This is not a unique idea, we see only in Thomas, but in fact, it's found in a lot of Jewish materials. We see Philo and Megillah and some Rabbinic Judaism, Genesis Rabbah. And so, in other words, together with a lot of sayings alluding to or directly referencing the creation accounts in Genesis, obviously, Thomas actively participates in the Jewish exegesis of the creation story to understand and to develop an advocate, for its protological eschatology, so to speak. But then, should we say that Thomas is a Jewish gospel in light of this understanding? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. But we should definitely understand the Gospel of Thomas within Judaism, especially Hellenistic Judaism. Why I am hesitating to say that this is a Jewish gospel, even we set aside any other related socio-historical conditions surrounding Thomas that we hard to know. There's one theological idea diverging from typical Jewish thought on God, mainly because of Thomas's interpretation of the two creation stories. Like I mentioned, Thomas is quite similar to other Jewish authors, who recognize the difference between the first and the second creation account in Genesis 1 to 3. So there's no difference. But when it comes to the other Jewish authors I show on the screen here and also in other sources, they definitely maintain the oneness of God who created this world and who is in charge of both of the two creations in Genesis. But when it comes to the Gospel of Thomas, we see that some tension, actually huge tension between Thomas's understanding of the first creation story versus the second creation. And this is argued in my hopefully for the coming publication. It's I'm revising now. And then looks like those rulers, powers, or someone, whoever they might be, in charge of the second creation is definitely cast in a negative light in the Gospel of Thomas, who divides one single one, original human being Adam into man and woman, so creation of two genders, and then that is the beginning of the whole problem in the human world. So for that matter, probably, Thomas is departing from the contemporaneous Hellenistic Jewish understanding of the creation stories, separating the gods or deities or powers of the second creation from divine one God in Genesis chapter 1. But still, its engagement, interpretive engagement with Genesis, just leads us into Thomas's really active, perhaps Platonizing midrash of Genesis 1, 2, 3. So that's my argument. And then let me wrap up my presentation. So what might this mean? Just as the sayings of Jesus and Thomas are often riddle-like, with their meanings hidden from many, the question of whether this gospel is truly Jewish will probably remain just as elusive. But this doesn't mean that we stop asking. We should keep probing the theological and social implications of its Jewish element for how we understand Thomas as a whole. So to borrow and reframe the well-known second logion in Thomas, let the scholar who seeks not stop seeking until she finds. When she finds, she will be disturbed. When she is disturbed, she will marvel and maybe even reign over the scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you, Yunyang Lim, for that fine presentation. We move on to Justin Martyr, our terminus ad quem for this conference. We have, in fact, two presentations on Justin. We will start with Katja Kuyanpe.
Greetings from Helsinki. First of all, I would like to thank you, the organizers, for this wonderful event. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll just put it on here. Is there a meaningful way that Justin Martyr could be positioned within Judaism? When looking for answers, I will focus on Justin's dialogue with Jewish Trypho, a long and repetitive treatise written in the form of a two-day dialogue with a Jew. For this work is more relevant for this conference than 1 and 2 apologies. If we begin with a very fuzzy criterion of a general Jewishness of a discourse, roughly meaning parallels with Jewish literature, then the dialogue with Trypho appears within Judaism indeed. The dialogue is all about the interpretation of the Jewish scriptures. The work reflects Jewish exegesis and possibly the author's past experiences of some real-life dialogues with learned Jews. So if parallels with, for example, rabbinic exegesis is for someone enough for situating Justin Martyr within Judaism, then be my guest. Yet if we move to the criterion of the author, the picture changes. Here we finally have an author writing in his own name, offering biographical information and certainly not, from his own point of view, practicing Judaism. Justin explicitly and proudly self-identifies as one of ethne. In the dialogue with Trypho, he seeks to construct a robust identity for non-Jewish Christians. This culminates in his notorious statement, "We are the true spiritual Israel and the descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham." While Justin acknowledges the existence of Christ-following Jews, this group often disappears from his binary argumentation in which we Gentiles, hemeista ethne, are opposed to you Jews. Justin's rhetoric constructs two stable, uniform, and distinct entities. However, individual passages show his ability to accept nuances within social reality. I argue that Justin writes in a context in which non-Christ-following Jews, Christ-following Jews, and Christ-following Gentiles who Judaize are part of his social reality, not merely literary fiction as older research has sometimes suggested. What about the criterion of a target audience? I think that the scholarly debate concerning the audience of a dialogue partly arises from a failure to distinguish between Justin's concerns and his audience. Traditionally, the dialogue has been read in accordance with its form. It was assumed to be written for winning over non-Christ-following Jews. As a substantial part of a dialogue consists of demonstrating that Jesus is the Messiah promised by the scriptures, this approach still has its adherents. However, I follow Matthijs den Dulk's conclusion that a non-Jewish Christ-following target audience best explains the content of a dialogue, and it is also the most probable alternative considering the realities of ancient book distribution. Justin writes to Gentile-born Christians of his own social circles, but he has several concerns. First, Justin fiercely opposes Christians who distinguish between the Creator in the Jewish scriptures and the Supreme God as Jesus' Father. He explicitly names Marcionites and Valentinians, for instance. Second, Justin reacts against Gentile Christian Judaizing. Justin has nothing against Torah-observant Christ-following Jews as long as they do not try to make Gentile believers observe Jewish practices. This is something he says explicitly. Judaizing Gentile Christians, he disapproves of. He mentions those who have been persuaded to live, quote, in complete accordance with the law, end of quote. And the context suggests that this might even mean circumcision. Justin puts considerable amount of effort to relativizing and subverting the value of circumcision so that it becomes first irrelevant and then even a sign of punishment. However, Justin is, compared to Barnabas, remarkably tolerant of the Judaizers suggesting that they too will likely be saved if they continue to confess Christ. Justin thus grudgingly accepts even the most radical Judaizers as part of the in-group. Third, the dialogue provides the Gentile Christian audience with arguments for discussions with Jews, while simultaneously and more importantly explaining why so few have become Christ followers. Justin refers several times to his hope that the Jews would accept a scriptural proof for Jesus. Yet he does not spare his words when describing the failings of the Jewish people. His vilification of the Jews addresses the credibility problem posed by the Jewish unbelief. His solution, in its simplicity, is that the Jewish rejection of Jesus has been prophesied by the scriptures. It is therefore not anomalous, but part of a divine plan. It is unclear if he thinks that they will eventually accept Christ. Depicting Jewish unbelief and the existence of Gentile believers as the fulfillment of scriptural prophecies culminates in Justin's identification of Christ followers as the true spiritual Israel. For Justin, Israel is a term which he values and wishes to transfer to Gentile believers. Yet he is not consistent in his ethnic reasoning. Denise Kimball insightfully summarizes this as follows. Quote, Justin vacillates among three views. One, Christians are the Israelite genos or ethnos of a people promised to Abraham. Two, Christians are a second, superior Israelite people. And three, Christians are a distinct people formed out of individuals from all human races, including Jews. End of quote. Two conclusions. Much of the dialogue is about positioning non-Jewish Christ followers vis-à-vis non-Christ following Jews. Justin develops tools for articulating a Gentile Christ following identity that is rhetorically opposite to Jewishness. Indebted to Jewish exegesis, he argues with Jewish concepts and appeals to the Jewish scriptures when he creates a scriptural past and ancestry for his non-Jewish audience and highlights their superiority. They have access, provided by God, to the correct interpretation of the scriptures. For what it is worth, Justin would not wish to be placed within Judaism. In his rhetoric, he is together with his audience sometimes beyond Judaism, sometimes opposite Judaism, sometimes the true Israel. If we look for a point where the within Judaism paradigm is not helpful anymore, I think that we find it with Justin. Thank you.
Thank you. We will proceed immediately with the final presentation on Justin by Kimberly Stratton.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm giving an argument for why I think this text kind of captures the moment of the parting of the ways here. Okay, so Justin's dialogue with Trypho is widely regarded as a pivotal text in what Daniel Boyarin describes as the production of an independent Christianity. I agree. I read it within Judaism as evidence for the moment when a new separate Christian identity begins to crystallize. I disagree with Boyarin and others, however, over the cause. I propose that the original dialogue addresses, and so when I say original, because I think there was kind of an original conversation that became the seed for later kind of theological, Christological developments, arguments against Marcion, etc., that were attached to it. So I'm trying to capture that kind of original conversation. Okay, so I propose that the original dialogue addresses questions of theodicy that arose in the wake of the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. More specifically, I argue that Justin's dialogue responds to accusations that non-observant Jesus followers violated the covenant and caused the revolt to fail. Justin harnesses logocentric Christology and supersessionism to justify Roman victory over Judea and to blame Judeans for their own misfortune. In this, he follows a long tradition going back to the Hebrew prophets, the Deuteronomic history, Jewish pseudepigrapha, and Josephus. Many scholars dismiss the dialogue's opening mise en scène as fictionalized and focus instead on Justin's Christological excursus. I regard the staging of this debate to be not only important for understanding the ensuing dialogue, but also a realistic reflection of actual conversations between Judeans and Jesus followers in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt. It presents a significant historical witness to one factor that I propose drove some Jesus followers to develop a distinct identity separate from Judeans at this time. The main topics of the debate, covenant obligations, Jesus' status as the anticipated Messiah, the identity of Israel, and the reliability of Scripture, flow naturally from the opening discussion of theodicy in response to the failed war. The need to restore coherence after the war transformed theoretical disagreements and differences into heated controversies upon which life itself seemed to hinge. In this opening scene, Justin is approached by Trypho, who says he recently escaped the war in Judea and is spending his days in Greece. Justin wears a philosopher's robe, which sparks a series of questions about theodicy as Trypho asks him to expound upon God's sole rulership, monarchias, and divine providence, pronoias. When Justin admits that he follows the philosophy of Jesus, so his philosophy, the conversation abruptly turns to a critique of the Jesus movement. Trypho admonishes Justin for being deceived by false claims and for following men who are not worthy. He asks what kind of salvation remains for someone who abandons God and places expectations in a man. Trypho advises him instead to observe the covenant laws of circumcision, the Sabbath, feasts, and new moon. Quote, absolutely, do all the things that are written in the law, and then likely you will receive mercy from God. Unquote. His repeated emphasis on the connection between salvation and observance of the law provides insight into what I regard to be Trypho's primary concern, so covenant theodicy. Like Josephus and other Judeans who responded to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, Trypho views the world through the lens of Deuteronomic theology, which ties national security to observance of God's law. In other words, Trypho thinks that Justin is a Jew of some sort who needs to follow Jewish law. So at this point in the debate, I think we could say that the dialogue is still within Judaism. Justin responds to these charges by asking Trypho to listen to his explanation of why, despite persecution, quote, we do not cease to acknowledge him. And Trypho agrees to listen, even as some of his companions laugh and insult Justin. One of them tosses out a remark, a logon, about the war in Judea. I focus on this remark because I regard it as an important key to understanding Justin's dialogue. Unfortunately, we do not know the precise contents of this logon because it is not quoted, but from Trypho's prior criticisms and from Justin's immediate reply, I surmise that it offered an account of the war that impugned certain followers of Jesus for abrogating Torah, angering God, and causing the rebellion to fail. So again, because they're regarded as Jews. So if this speculation is correct, Justin's response makes the greatest sense. Because in the very next sentence, he retorts, quote, and there is nothing else for which we are blamed, dear fellow, than this. We do not live according to the law, nor are we circumcised in the flesh like your ancestors, or observe the Sabbath like you. Actually, it's a question, like you, question mark. So Justin then turns the blame back onto Judeans, asserting that God has forsaken them for killing Jesus. So using the language of we and you, which was noted earlier regarding these texts, to differentiate between Judeans and Gentile Jesus followers, Justin baldly asserts that the recent defeat in Judea is proof that God rejected you for killing the just one and transferred his covenant to us who constitute the true Israel. The rest of the dialogue is a lengthy attempt to demonstrate with scriptural proof texts that Jesus supersedes the written law and is foretold in the scriptures. So conflict over observance of covenantal law in this text does not cut along a Jewish-Christian binary, but is part of an internal conversation among Judeans, which at this moment still includes Gentile followers of Jesus, in a manner that recalls conflicts between Paul and other apostles over circumcision, or criticism against certain prophets in the Apocalypse of John over eating meat sacrificed to Greco-Roman deities. Trypho charges that followers of Jesus claim to be pious, but do not separate themselves from the nations and differentiate their way of living. Trypho's accusation that Justin and his compatriots anger God by putting their faith in a crucified Savior and ignoring the law at their peril signals his understanding that Jesus' followers are members of the Judean community and subject to the covenant. They may be wrong about the Messiah's identity and misguided, but Trypho insists that observance of covenantal law is incumbent upon them for divine protection and mercy, as it is for all other Judeans. Justin's argument that Jesus replaces the law refutes Trypho's assertion that covenantal obligations apply to Jesus' followers. Significantly, Justin does not assert that Christians form a different religion at this point. Instead, he argues that Jesus replaces the law for all believers. So Christianity is not being presented here as a separate religion yet. So in fact, Justin reinforces this ambiguous status of Jesus people by using the labels we and you throughout the first half of the dialogue. The debate thus unfolds, at least initially, between two internecine camps, not two distinct religions. Furthermore, the label Christian does not yet appear to apply to Judean Jesus followers. So I think initially it's only Gentile Jesus followers. So Justin finally self-identifies as Christian in chapter 63 when he describes it as a unifying identity for all believers in Jesus as the Christ. Quote, "And above all, that the word of God speaks to those who believe in him as being one soul and one synagogue and one church, as to a daughter, to the church that is called by his name and participates in his name, for we are all called Christians. In like manner, clearly the words proclaim, teaching us to forget the customs of our forefathers." So at the same time that Justin embraces this new identity derived from the name of Christ, he also asserts that being Christian involves forgetting one's ancestral customs. Thus, Justin resolves the ambiguous position of non-observant Christ followers vis-a-vis the law by constructing a new category, what we would consider to be a new religion, which encompasses all followers of Jesus. This step towards independence from Judaism accomplishes two things. As Boyarin points out, it resolves the identity crisis that Gentile Jesus people faced from being neither Jew nor Greek. It simultaneously rebutted charges of abrogating Torah and angering God, causing the Judean revolt to fail. So I realize that's kind of an idiosyncratic argument, but I think it kind of helps. So in other words, we can read, it's not really reading it within Judaism. I think we read it as this moment when some Christians are kind of saying, okay, we are not Jewish, we're something else, right? And then later that conversation, as I understand it, it's sort of like, when you've had an argument with somebody and then later in the shower, you're kind of thinking, oh, I wish I'd said this or I wish I'd said that. And you build on it, that just kind of this conversation, which occurred over 2 days, then kind of rolls around in Justin's mind, and decades later, he writes it out and then adds to it all the things he wished he'd said, all the proof texts he wished he had, and includes in there, I think, responses to dualism and Marcionism and stuff. So it's at that point, I think it is a text within emerging Christian debates, right? And it's not a Jewish text. But I think when we're reading this initial conversation, it's a fascinating kind of glimpse onto this moment where kind of the light bulb goes off and someone says, oh, no, we're not Jews. We don't have to observe that law. This isn't our fault. This is your fault because you killed the just one. So, okay, that's my reading of Justin's dialogue with Trypho. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Yes, thanks for that. It's intriguing to think about the dialogue from Trypho's point of view. So we now have time for discussion, and there are a lot of things we can do. As I was listening to all of these very fascinating presentations, my first reaction in my mind was like, well, in some ways, this variety of literature that we've looked at is similar to the variety of works that are in the New Testament. Some of the works within the New Testament fit more comfortably within the rubric within Judaism, however defined. Others, not so much. Others are kind of neutral. There aren't that many polemics. I'm thinking of the Johannine epistles that were alluded to in our previous panel. Well, there's really not a lot of polemic or references to that question. And we kind of see something similar from my point of view. That's my initial reaction to the presentations in this panel. And in particular with the Gospels, we might talk about the Gospels that were covered in this panel, the Protoevangelium of James. I know that Lily might not be able to be with us right now, but also the Gospel of Thomas, that at least when we're talking about the Jewishness or within Judaism or as Jewish texts, there is potential, similar potential or similar non-potential of locating these texts under this rubric by breaking the canon, the canonical lines. Protoevangelium of James, very similar in its content and some of its outlook with the infancy gospels that are in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But then we have the Gospel of Thomas as well, Yun Young, as you were relating them to the synoptic Gospels at the beginning of your presentation. I know that Francis Watson was very much encouraged years ago to look beyond the canonical lines that divide the Gospels. I don't know your response, if you want to respond to that comment, because you've worked, Yun Young, on the Gospel of Thomas, but also on the Gospel of Matthew. You've brought that together in your book for a different topic. What's your view on that question?
Yeah, I mean, so we need to think about, we need to rethink the canon. I mean, just canonization is just such a really unstable and political, process, as we all know. And for example, the first time, the Gospel of Thomas was mentioned and then labeled as a book, as a heretical work, was only dated around in the late, let's see, early 3rd century by Hippolytus of Rome, for example, and possibly by origin, maybe it might be confused between the Gospel of Thomas and the infancy Gospel of Thomas. But anyhow, we are pretty much just influenced by heresiologists, thoughts and frame of, orthodoxy versus heresy. But once we try to go beyond, that frame, actually we see more striking similarities between these works, including the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels. So even when we set aside the source critical, relationship questions, still there are a lot of, valid, points we can make in terms of diversity of theological ideas, and then vibrant responses to Judaism when these communities, try to form their identity. So absolutely, we definitely need to go beyond, canonization. It's a long process and very discursive. So.
Thank you for that response, and we might come back to the Gospel of Thomas proper. The next two presentations overlapped a bit because they were dealing with the Epistle of Barnabas, and I know Gavin has to go in and out this time, but if he is there, etc., I don't know if Gavin and Jason want to converse with one another or add some points. I know, Gavin, you said you had more to say. This could be an opportunity for us to focus on Barnabas, for example.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So just to be warned that my children have just returned, and so things could get loud. I wanted to say that I don't really disagree with anything that Jason Moraff said, as I had chosen the topic of Clement and Barnabas because of the shared things I mentioned in my presentation there. Their use of the scripture, their discussion about Israel, use of apocryphal texts. And what I started it had been a very long time since I read Barnabas, so I had proposed the paper before I actually reread it. And the more I read it, the more I became very kind of pale. Trying to, how am I supposed to argue someone's within Judaism if they don't believe they're even in continuity with Israel, which I kind of expect from this is a supersessionist text. I don't know, it's hard or soft or whatever, but it's definitely some kind of supersessionism. I'm trying to struggle. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that, like, my thought experiment was, like, if these had been in the New Testament, we would have probably as much about Barnabas today as we have about John, the different perspectives on John. And in some ways, it's kind of a warning, how much special pleading or kind of other argumentations that we're doing to try to uncover what we don't really know. When I think about these two texts in particular, I imagine that the consensus is probably right that these are either addressed to Gentiles or written by Gentiles. But I also think that when a Gentile converted to Christianity in the first century, they thought of themselves as converting to a kind of Judaism. To really have one religion to convert to. And it reminded me of what you had cited Shai Cohen's article, which I had revisited yesterday for that precise reason. I underlined where he says the paths never converged. Well, if you have Gentiles converting to Christianity, believing that they're converting to a kind of Judaism, then they did converge at this point. And I think of Barnabas in particular in two different ways. One is if I don't know if you're familiar with the meme format, we have X at home. It's like where a child asks their mother, Mom, can we have this? Can we have X? And the mom replies, you don't need X, we have X at home. And X at home is something that's inferior, decidedly inferior to X. And so Barnabas, he's writing to a group of people who want to be Jews. And he goes, we would like to adopt Jewish practices. He goes, you don't need Jewish practices, we have Judaism at home. And Judaism at home is, celebrating on Sunday instead of the Sabbath, or, not associating with people instead of avoiding pork, things like that. I eventually want to talk about, like, what if I write these ideas down, I need to talk about the Clementine romance, which I brought up recently, which opened me to the idea that you could be, Clement in that novel is a Jewish convert. It doesn't use Christian or Christianity, so we can think of Gentile converts to Christianity as Jews in a sort of way, which opened up some paths to me that have been blocked in the past. But I think I've talked too much. I would like Jason at least to respond or put in whatever he's thinking.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Go ahead, Jason.
Gavin, I think I'm basically conceding in the opposite direction that, I think without this explicit othering, I think what makes Barnabas so fascinating is his reticence to adopt Israel as his historic group's identification. With Justin, we're Israel, but with Barnabas, we're not. Yet at the same time, we stand in the legacy of some who are in Israel. There's the affinity with Moses and a lot of the rites that are described. Israel of the flesh, or if we were to put it that way, doesn't understand the practices correctly. But we're talking about the same things. We're arguing about the same texts. So I do think the relationship is more complicated. It's just, I do think we've just taken an additional step with if you think about Paul in Romans 9 through 11, these are my brothers, and they're hardened, they might be ignorant, they're missing something. It's, we are not them. But a lot of the conversation sounds similar. The battleground of text is similar. The reasoning, there's a lot of consonants there, which, in contrast to Ignatius, makes Barnabas almost a better candidate to be read within Judaism. But we're still doing this further othering. It's not like a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls have come up over the past few days. This isn't, they're the unfaithful in Israel. It's just that whole category we're shoving off. And even the use of the scriptures is Katya has a wonderful article on this. We're basically withholding the sacred texts for us, not for them. So even the purpose in using those texts differs. Whereas for Ignatius, you noted that, or maybe alluded to some of the more ambivalence towards it, towards Israel's scriptures. He uses the prophets, but then you have the comment about the archives. But he seems a little more adamant. Christianism is not Judaism. And so in different ways, we're taking a step from, I think, the reasoning of the Gospels and the conflicts and competition and polemics there, or even from Paul's writings, toward what we start to see a little more full-throated in somebody like Justin Martyr.
I wanted to add something that's just implicit in my talk, is that I consider a text Jewish if the author considers himself Jewish, and I don't know. I mean, I would not consider, if other people don't consider him Jewish, I don't know what makes them the gatekeepers. The thing about Barnabas is that we don't know, despite all of his bluster. And also, I don't know how important a witness this is for the parting of the ways, because for all I know, this is one guy yelling at a cloud. He's moving toward Justin, but he's not just, and his emphasis that we're still keeping the law seems wrong-headed. I mean, in terms of, he was not followed in this aspect. So that's it's a very singular figure, and I'm very puzzled over this text. The one thing I can say is that it should be read in conjunction with Second Baruch and 4 Ezra, even if some people claim that citations are inexact, which they are. But those three, I think, should be read together. That's one way. That's one way of reading them within Judaism. All three need to be read.
It is intriguing, though, that even if it's pseudonymous, it's identified with Barnabas, who is not just a Jew, but a Levi, you could say a Cohen of sorts, which is quite striking, that association with the letter. Katja has her hand raised, so we'll go to Katja.
Thanks. I've got a question to Gavin. So you nicely emphasized that Barnabas argues for keeping the law, or well, he thinks we are keeping the law. My question is, his understanding is that the Mosaic law never had a literal sense. That was only a misunderstanding from the very beginning. It's not that the dietary laws would be no longer valid. They were never valid. Circumcision was never valid. It was from the very beginning a complete misunderstanding. So if this is the case, that Barnabas somehow negates the Jewish practices based on the Mosaic law completely, doesn't that sort of, in what sense is it sensible to say that he is still maintaining or upholding the Mosaic law if it has no literal sense whatsoever?
At this point, I would wonder, I wish I knew more about Philo's opponents that he talks about for 4 sentences, and on the migration of Abraham, where he says that they're doing exactly the same thing, is that they have allegorized the law to such an extent they don't think they actually need to do any of the things, including circumcision. I believe circumcision is literally, or it's mentioned explicitly there. I mean, that's a good question. I didn't say it was an effective piece of rhetoric, but that's what he's arguing. I don't have profound thoughts to answer your questions. I won't pretend. I do by extending my answer.
It's making me think of an anachronistic scenario that I'll just create right now. Imagine 2,000 years from now, archaeologists excavate the jewelry that survived in the material data of today, and then, or just a century or two earlier, and they come across classical Reform Judaism and some classical Reform Jews doing away with circumcision, with Sabbath. Let's just go to temple on Sunday. What would we make of that? Would that still be considered Jewish 2,000 years from now? In hindsight, to make me think about, I wish we had more evidence, as you said, about the allegorizers that Philo is accusing in his writings. So there's something interesting going on with Ignatius, with Barnabas, that is somewhat different from some of the literature that's in the New Testament. Jason Moraff is a contributor to the volume that was advertised earlier this morning, coming out hopefully next year, Luke and Acts within Second Temple Judaism, comparing Luke and Acts with Ignatius and Barnabas. So keep an eye on that article. On the other hand, First Clement, I mean, it's quoting Judith, which is really intriguing. No polemics there whatsoever. So a different take on this matter. Maybe we can move to the Didache. Lutz doing. There were two things that came up during your presentation that intrigued me. One was, and I'd be very interested to hear your take on this, how the Didache seems to take it for granted that maybe you pray 3 times a day. And so you alluded to the Amidah, the emergent practice of praying 3 times a day for the Amidah. Although there is in the rabbinic literature a machloket about whether the Ma'ariv, the evening prayer, needed to be recited or not. Big famous story in Tractate Brachot. And so I was intrigued that the Didache is like, well, you pray 3 times a day. So that's one thing there. I don't know if you have anything to speak about that. The second thing is you were alluding to the possible relationship between, or the similar milieu of the Didache with the Gospel of Matthew. And since we did have a panel on the Gospel of Matthew, the Didache was raised in passing. Unfortunately, we couldn't deal with that. I was wondering if you could speak a bit to those 2 matters.
Yeah, I think there's a strong connection between the Didache and the Gospel of Matthew. There's a bit of debate whether it relates only to the supposed Q material. There have been people who say, well, actually, in some respects, the Didache is closer to Luke than to Matthew. But in terms of some debates regarding the hypocrites in particular, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you find exactly the 2 topics there as well connected with the hypocrites, fasting and prayer, although developed in different ways, not about the time and the contents of the fasting, but of the of the prayer, but of the mode of the prayer. You should also go into your room and pray there in secret, in a way that's very different. And there's a development. I see a change in the Didache as over against the material in the Gospel of Matthew. But there is certainly a kind of connection and I would say a continuing milieu. Usually we say, where do we locate the Didache? Syria, and that's a very good option, of course. I'm not sure whether it's Antioch, but it's the kind of southern Syria or something like that. That's probably an area not too far probably from where we would locate Matthew. So there's a shared tradition, although again a development regarding the 3 times for prayer. That's right. But that has obviously to do with the fact that you had only 2 Tamid offerings, which you then should replace by prayer. And the question is then, what do you do with the 3rd one? Now, the 3rd one comes from Daniel and from a Psalms passage where you have got 3 times of prayer a day, which is, however, not an obligatory but a voluntary one. I mean, Daniel, when he prays 3 times a day, he does this on a voluntary basis. But I think we see here ways, perhaps, a kind of discourse in which, after the destruction of the temple, after the sacrifices have fallen away, a kind of replacement of sacrifice with a thrice daily prayer. I'm not claiming this is the kind of normative prayer of the Jews at the time. I'm rather claiming that it's connected with a particular group, with the hypocrites, and I would see again the hypocrites coming out of a discussion that we see also in Matthew 23, focusing on the Pharisees. So there seems to be a kind of continuity, whether these are historical Pharisees or rather they are successors in a way, late comers within that movement, which are still called Pharisees here. I'm not quite sure about. But I don't see it as referring to Judaism in general. But on the other hand, as I said, the Didache also regulates and tries to regulate for non-Jewish Christ believers who are in a way obligated to bear as much as they can from what's called the yoke of the Lord. And that's what I see again with a certain proximity to the Gospel of Matthew as the Torah as interpreted by Jesus or by the Kyrios, by the Lord. Yeah, I'm assuming, of course, and I would also assume this for the Gospel of Matthew, that it's not only the things that are mentioned explicitly in the Sermon on the Mount or in the Sectio Evangelica, which are the objects of that observance. There are certainly other things there. We heard about food laws. We heard about idol meat and other things. So there seems to be something like a halacha or kind of maybe a knowledge about Jewish law or something like that around to which these non-Jewish Christ believers are drawn or are told to obey as much as they can, bear as much as you can. And so it's opening up this kind of mixed debate or this mixed group in a way. And at this point, I think the competition with these hypocrites, with their practices, attempts at establishing one's own or the group's own practice in a way, but that doesn't really attest to a split which is already complete, but rather to the aspiration to set out boundaries in a way, and indirectly attests to some kind of conversation or connection which is still there. Whether that's useful to call it within Judaism, I'm not quite sure. I like this earlier term that you presented, with Judaism, or perhaps in the context or something like that, in engagement with Judaism. The question is certainly about social location, social and ethnic location. And we are very clear that we have here an ethnic opening up to include non-Jews. I mean, and then the long range, the question will be, will these people of the Didache still be recognized as Jews or Judeans? And I'm doubtful about that in the longer range, at least. Yeah. And the reception history of the text, which means that it has been included in the apostolic constitutions, in the Ethiopic synodos and other literature there, also shows that it has been not necessarily been identified as a Jewish text, but as being appropriate as a later Christian text. But when the text is generated, I think we are still before that kind of split.
Yeah. If I'll maybe follow up with one thing as you were talking about, bearing the yoke, bearing what you can, right? In chapter 6, verse 1. And I was thinking during your presentation, why is it that the Didache doesn't mention blood and strangled meat? And I thought Revelation also doesn't mention that, right? You should refrain from food offered to idols, also refrain from porneia. Paul doesn't mention refraining from blood or strangled meat, but does qualify interacting with sacrifices offered to idols. Do you see chapter 6 as it's addressed to Gentiles, and bearing what you can would be, if you can refrain from blood and strangled meat, would that be so difficult to observe for a Gentile in the 1st or 2nd century?
I think it would be included in bear what you can. The question is simply the question is simply, is the Didache less strict about blood and nevela than the apostolic decree? Because the apostolic decree would say no, you shouldn't do this, and it explicitly includes it amongst the 4 abstentions that are obligated or that are kind of encroached on the non-Jewish Christ believers. Here we don't have this. I suggested in my presentation it might be because if you come from Jewish sensitivities, you don't have to state this anymore, because that's anyway out of the question. You wouldn't eat blood, yeah. You wouldn't eat nevela. You don't have to repeat this in a way. That might be in the background of it. On the other hand, one can always debate why something is not mentioned. I mean, this is always questionable in itself. Yeah, but it's interesting that the apostolic decree considers it necessary to state this, whereas here we don't have that particular statement. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that. I'd like to turn to Angela, your presentation, and thanks for presenting on the Shepherd of Hermas. You wrote a book on this recently, so just for the readers and attendees who are listening, do check that work out. One thing that stood out for me was when you're talking about, well, if we do think of this book as under the rubric of the questions proposed for this conference, maybe we can think more about the shepherd along this continuum with Jewish apocalypses, apocalyptic works, and I just thought, well, there are some apocalypses that are more oriented towards the spatial, the otherworldly reality. Thinking of segments in Second Enoch, for example, because you mentioned the scholarship on the shepherd, which I'm not very familiar with. They've been sort of dissuaded from going there because of the absence of eschatological elements. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that was one thing I did jot in my notes during your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. This is the book that Isaac is talking about. It's looking at the Book of Visions, focusing on the first part of the shepherd. And, the shepherd has been described as a failed apocalypse. So that's seems to be a harsh assessment in some ways. I think, one of the things that I use in this book is sort of different approaches like cognitive literary theory to think about to reflect on my own sort of reading practices as a scholar. And I think that oftentimes when we read a text like this as a scholar, we're so trained in our discipline to read against the grain of the narrative that we look for things that maybe the text is not interested in showing. So the book is really about why was this text so popular, and why do modern scholars find it to be so boring? So it's a very interesting kind of contrast. If you read people who've written like an 800-page commentary on the Shepherd of Hermas, in the first 10 pages is a very tedious and boring text. And then they kind of go off and sort of break it down into so it's sort of raising this question, like, what do the book, on the shepherd was kind of a chance for me to reflect on what's our disciplinary training? How does that influence how we think about a text in antiquity that we don't have in some ways like social context to read and to read for enjoyment? That's what I sort of suggest in the book, that the text was received by its earliest communities in a way that is very different from how we as scholars are trained to read. In some ways, it probably that idea probably connects to what the Enoch Seminar is trying to do, sort of to make us more self-conscious of what our reading practices are. What are our habits of reading? What do we go to a text like the Shepherd of Hermas? What are we looking for? When I look at the scholarship on the Shepherd of Hermas, I find that scholars are looking at that canonical question. That's a huge question. They look at that kind of doctrinal discussion about baptism, and sort of they try to do a little study of the church, sort of the emerging church, Christian church, right? So those are like the social history of the church as we move forward. Those are very different questions from the ones that the Enoch Seminar, is inviting us to look at with the shepherd. Maybe that would have been a better way for me to do my presentation, but I find that there's very little. What I would say, it's very different from the other texts, I think, that you put me in this group with these other texts that are, I think, much more Christian than the shepherd. I think the shepherd is only like loosely Christian. I mean, it doesn't have some of the big things that we're looking for, like, that would attach it to Christianity. So, I mean, some of it, you have some references, to Clement or these people that are thought to be certain figures, but there's not that explicit or self-conscious awareness, I think. So anyway, I think this whole webinar sort of just makes me even more aware of how much our disciplinary training to sort of look at a text and to read it against the grain of what, the Shepherd of Hermas, I think, was kind of an entertaining text. You know, it was popular, I think, because Hermas is a little bit of an entertaining character. I don't think he was a historical, quote unquote, historical person per se, but I think we lose some of the popular appeal of the shepherd when we sort of hold on to that disciplinary reading, those disciplinary reading practices, which also sort of push us to see the shepherd more as a sort of early Christian catechetical work, you know, which is how it was known. So I mean that totally makes sense. I see Lutz has his hand up. He must be saying he's going to say something about what I've said about
I've
the
got
shepherd.
one question, if I may ask that question,
Yes.
because I haven't heard much about apocalypticism or apocalyptic or whatever you prefer regarding the Shepherd of the Shepherd of Hermas. So would that be a take of considering the shepherd in a kind of genre-related perspective, together with other apocalypses, Jewish and non-Jewish, quote unquote? I mean, with scare quotes. We had a conference last year on the Apocalypse of John in the context of other Jewish texts, and that was there's a volume coming out of that, not next year probably, and so that might be promising as well, and also perhaps bracket some of the boundaries that we have here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, well, my book is sort of like looking at the visions. So focusing on that genre, you know, a failed apocalypse label that the shepherd carries around, and to move away from the hard and fast sort of genre. I'm actually working on a book on apocalypses where I'm going to propose it's not about otherworldly journeys far away or about future events. Apocalypses are actually interested in the here and now, and they're really designed to grab your attention and to get you, the reader, to change your moral behavior. So for me, I find that the paranetic aspect of apocalypses far more outweigh any kind of desire to tell us what's going to happen in a future moment. And that's why I think, you know, the shepherd, when we look at the shepherd, people oftentimes bracket that paranetic information to what comes after the Book of Visions. But I think the Book of Visions actually has quite a bit of that. And the visions, the interesting quality, the humor of Hermas, it's all sort of priming the pump to expand our receptivity to the other kind of teaching. So in the shepherd, you know, right after Vision 5, all of a sudden it's not Hermas as a separate character. It's like you, the reader, are the person sort of in dialogue with the shepherd, the angel of repentance, or whoever it is, the person that is the character, the shepherd. And so it's really, I think, trying to bring you, the reader, into the text so that you imbibe, I think, a little bit more what that paranetic aspect is. So for me, you know, I think it functions just like other apocalypses function, right? They're not really, they pretend to be interested in the future, and I'm not saying they're not, but it's really in the service of the here and now. They pretend to be interested in what happens in the heavens, but actually they want you to pay attention to how you live your life in the everyday, you know? So that, I think, when we think about it as a catechetical text for everyday living, I think, yeah, I can see how it does that. But we should combine it with its sort of visionary aspects. You know, why do you have vision? You know, this came up with somebody's discussion of Epistle of Barnabas. Why do you have visions or apocalyptic material connected, you know, at all with some of these things? And I think that's, for me, that's the project I'm working on. You know, I think it helps us. Apocalypses are a journey that are texts that are designed to help us sort of think about our moral behavior. So that's something I think we lose when we don't connect the Shepherd of Hermas with that very broad Jewish apocalyptic framework. And I think all of those texts are really more concerned about how do you live your life in the here and now, except the shepherd is using humor and not fear to sort of get that. But you still have the visionary elements. You still have a lot of the surprise type of elements that are still being deployed. So that's what I would say.
Thanks for that. When you said Shepherd of Hermas is considered to be a boring text, it's long, boring, and made me think it's
Some say, not me. No, not
some say
me.
that about Second Baruch as well. There was an Enoch seminar on Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, and most participants were expressing enthusiasm about Fourth Ezra, not so much about Second Baruch, which is a long text.
That's not true.
Kim,
That's not true. I was very
not the truth.
enthusiastic about Second Baruch. It has a nice letter at the end. So
it does. Do check Lutz's book on letter writing, which deals with Second Baruch, among other things. Kimberly, you had your hand raised, and so this is a good opportunity for you to talk. And then I'd like to ask a couple questions to the presenters on Justin Martyr. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a question because I feel like maybe some of the problems we're having situating texts within or without Judaism is because we're centralizing Judaism. I feel like we're in a conversation where we're trying to, we're making our interpretations and understandings of so-called Christian texts a little more complex, but we're leaving Judaism and these boundaries of Judaism less interrogated. So a question for, is it Enyang? Is that how you pronounce your name? Is sort of like, why not situate Gospel of Thomas within Hellenistic Judaism and just say it's another expression? I mean, we've already accepted that Philo can present a Middle Platonist version of Judaism that's Hellenized, but still counts as Judaism. So then where are we putting this boundary where we all collectively have agreed that something isn't Jewish anymore? And is it because we're accepting, we have some kind of uninterrogated definition of Judaism with which we're operating? That's kind of all I wanted to say, and that maybe these texts and this whole conversation is kind of exploding the boundaries, not just of Christian and the New Testament canon and sort of trying to add more complexity and nuance to that, but we should do the same for the Jewish side as well. That's kind of
At least with the text like Shepherd of Hermas, there might be some heuristic potential with this within Judaism category, because one concern might be that this rubric will eventually become a cliche or even a confining category. And well, with some texts, actually, it might be a category that has probative value. Yun Young, did I mispronounce your name? Because I'm used to seeing it with a U, and I think you just corrected the spelling on your Zoom window.
Yeah, I don't know why, but
All
I
right.
just realized that everybody just call me Annyeong. So I found it strange and then realized that, my Zoom name is, it has a typo. So I just fixed it. It's
All right.
Annyeong.
Okay, good. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Can I ask a couple questions to the presenters on Justin Martyr? So, Katja, one of the statements that caught my attention from your presentations, here we finally have an author who says, hey, I am from the ethne, right? I mean, here we also finally have an author whose identity we know, right? He comes from Samaria, Neapolis, Gentile, because that's been one of the issues throughout this conference, the identity of the author, the ethnicity of the author. So here, lo and behold, Justin Martyr. A question I have for both you, Katja, and Kimberly is, do you make a distinction, and maybe you could repeat this, sometimes I was distracted as the chair with things going behind the scenes, between what Justin expects or how he relates to Judaizing Gentiles, so Gentiles who are adopting Jewish custom, and Jewish followers of Jesus. So, Jews who do confess Jesus. I was wondering if both of you, or either one of you, or none of you want to speak to that.
I could begin. So this definitely shows his awareness of many different groups. It's in dialogue 46 and 47, where he lists all kinds of different groups, and he has no problem at all with Torah observant Christ following Jews. The only thing is that they are not supposed to force, and that's his word, force other Christ followers to also follow the Torah. As long as they don't do that, everything's fine. And that's a very interesting thing, because as a whole, there is relatively little about these Torah observant Christ followers in the dialogue that tends to use this binary rhetoric. And then he clearly disapproves of Judaizers that start observing the dietary laws, might even consider circumcision and so on. But they are still part of an in-group, clearly, in his rhetoric, as long as they show their allegiance to Christ. And that's an opportunity, a possibility he entertains, that they might be so enthusiastic about becoming Jews that they would totally abandon Christ. That's very interesting. He mentions that possibility. But in contrast to Barnabas, who makes like the circumcision a sign of who's in and who's out, Justin seems to accept even Gentiles who get circumcised as part of an in-group. The only thing is that they need to still confess Christ.
Thanks for clarification. I don't know, Kimberly, you want to add anything to that or anything else you didn't have time to say about Justin Martyr?
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent answer. She's clearly thought that answer out a lot more than I have. But that's my understanding too, is that in reading Justin, you see the diversity of different, sort of Jesus believing groups, and that as long as you're not forcing the law onto the Gentiles, the Gentile like Jesus believing Christ believers, then he's okay with that. So he's really the issue to me, again, as I focus much more on that introduction to the dialogue, is about the blaming, like sort of he takes this blame for who's at fault in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and then a lot of this is sort of expanded from that initial conversation. But yeah, I thought Katya's answer was very robust. And
I really found intriguing your take with like, well, let's look at this from Triffel's point of view, and that there's almost some kind of expectation from Justin before this dialogue is constructed in literary form, that hey, maybe you are like one of us, or you should be like one of us. There's some kind of expectations. Made me think of the Pharisees, for example, as they're portrayed in the Synoptic Gospels, and even the disciples of John who come to Jesus and ask, "Why don't your disciples fast?" But this is viewed as still an intra-Jewish debate, and you should be doing certain things that we are doing as Jews. We're starting to like transition here to the concluding remarks of the entire conference because of time, and we need to finish in a very timely fashion because one of the organizers needs to leave right at 2:15 p.m. sharp Eastern time when this ends. And so I'm going to maybe already shift there to make sure that everything that needs to be said will be said. And if there's still a few minutes, we can come back to anything that still needed to be said or wanted to be said in this panel. I'm looking at a question in the Q&A. This is not in the chat button, but in Q&A that was sent by Bernadette Bruden, who has been attending this conference throughout. I saw Bernadette during the first session, also during parts of the second session. And this is actually posted in the previous panel on John. And I'm just going to read it out loud. You can see it yourself. I thank you, Jörg Frey, for your important comment concerning your Korean students. So we were talking about how a lot of our discussion about within Judaism, Jewish texts, supersessionism is something that has been taking place in a North American, European context. Coming back to Bruden's question, as you allude to, this means that discussing how the New Testament and related writings in relation to Judaism, all exegesis is contextual, which white interpreters in Europe and North America and other largely Anglophone countries seldom articulate. Could any of the panelists comment on the larger purpose of the topic of the seminar? And I think that's why I'm going to this question here, because it's apropos for the larger purpose of the conference, for the conclusion of this conference. This is a time also where participants who are online, who have participated in the other panels, could join us if they want to. Just let us know, let Megan know, and we can bring you to the virtual floor. I mean, my first response to that, and then I'll allow others to talk in, is, I mean, our first purpose was to answer those three questions. The three questions. Do you think that a text is within or not within Judaism? By Judaism here, we mean early Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, which could of course, be further defined and complexified, and was during the discussion. What are the criteria? And we tried to discuss those criteria for determining that question. And then the so what changes if we do read text X or text Y within or without Judaism. So that was the general purpose of the conference, prompted by the popularization of this phrase within Judaism, which really took off within Pauline studies, but is now gravitating to other sectors and being interpreted in different ways. Of course, I would say just personally, we or I must be ethically mindful of what the implications of these questions might have for contemporary issues. But we were really wanting, first of all, to look at what was the promise, the potential for elucidating these texts in their ancient and late antique contexts. So that's like a general question, general response of mine to that question. But we have now time for some concluding remarks or observations. I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in. Gabriele, I don't know if you have any takeaways from this marathon, 2 segments that we had reading the New Testament within Judaism.
First of all, I would like to thank everybody for attending this conference. Very interesting sessions. The Enoch Seminar is an open forum, so we don't have to reach any common conclusion. I mean, each of us has simply to take from the conference what you like, okay? But I think that I think would be useful also for you to know my point of view. I mean, just expressing some points. I think many people said that the within Judaism term is very problematic. Other terms could be better, okay? In any case, we should not attach to the phrase within Judaism a predetermined sets of conclusions, okay? Is a method, is not a conclusion. And nonetheless, I think that this conference also has proved that this term is quite heuristically quite useful, because it generated some very interesting discussions regarding of this imperfection. One thing that I would like to stress is that we need the narrative, we need the language that makes sense of the very complicated and diverse situation. I mean, we are not here to decide whether a text is within Judaism or outside Judaism, because we discover in this discussion that there are some texts that are a little bit in between. Within Judaism, within Hellenistic Judaism, transitional text, I don't know, but we don't have to cut off all nuances, just in a binary decision, is it Jewish or is not, or is it within Judaism or is not. We have different stages, and so we must be aware of it. And from I got from this final panel is that we should definitely include non-canonical text. I mean, even though we have devoted a final session to non-canonical, I mean, we realize that this is not a good thing, because as Isaac said before, we have seen the same range of possibilities, the same kind of discussion that we had with many other New Testament texts, and some of the non-canonical texts are from the time in which other New Testament texts were written. What I would say that I found particularly interesting is that we have found also some texts that we have definitely said that are not within Judaism, like Ignatius or Justin, which I think would have helped us also in the discussion of previous texts. For instance, we cannot say that the Gospel of John is exactly as the letter of Ignatius or exactly as just in Martyr. So again, we need the language that makes sense of all these nuances. Once again, we said that we should not, we talk about sectarianism, we talk about supersessionism, we talk about the fact that if we say that a text is or is Jewish or should be read within Judaism, it doesn't mean that it's less Christian or belong less to the Jesus movement. Okay, so it's not like in the past in which we were discussing whether Jesus was Jewish or Christian, just in terms of excluding from one field or another. I mean, we know that Christianity was born as a messianic and apocalyptic movement within Second Temple Judaism, then found a new environment in Hellenistic Judaism very soon, and then parted. But this was a very gradual process that had different steps and stages and did not happen overnight. So I think that this conference has been a very interesting exercise. I mean, very productive. I learned a lot, and has emphasized the need for discussing more this complex relationship between Christianity and Judaism in antiquity. And I consider it a step forward to the time in which we are discussing Judaism and Christianity one against the other, or we are simply comparing Christianity and Judaism without understanding the role that the early Jesus movement played within Second Temple Judaism, also in changing the conversation, contributing to the conversation that was at the time very, very, very much alive. So let me say just a final thing. As the director of the Enoch Seminar, I'm very satisfied with the series of events that we had on the Within Judaism perspective. And I would like to give a special thank to Isaac Oliver. You were wonderful, Isaac. You're wonderful for your organization, for the way in which you chaired all the sessions, and also to Megan. I don't see her in my screenshot, but thank you so much. You made everything looks very easy, but believe me, there is a lot of work behind the scenes. So I hope to see you again to other initiative of the Enoch Seminar in person or online. We want to continue to be this open forum to specialists in Second Temple Judaism and Christian origins. Not be afraid of dealing with even the most controversial topics, but always ready to dialogue and conversation in a very, I hope, friendly and relaxing atmosphere. So thank you for all the panelists, for all the people that remain in the audience, and not only those who have followed our live on Zoom, but also the many that have followed us live on YouTube, and the many who will read the recordings afterwards.
I'd like to acknowledge our gratitude for the vision of Gabriele Boccaccini in not only creating the Enoch Seminar, but also in organizing and co-chairing this conference as well. Thank you, Gabriele. So for those who are watching or watch this video, please remember that you can see the recordings afterwards, which will be kindly uploaded by Megan Wines onto the Enoch Seminar YouTube channel. In the meantime, we'll wrap this session up, conclude the conference. Best of wishes to everyone who participated in this panel and the other panels, and I hope to see you soon in person or online.